The air was still, dense with early morning humidity that clung to every blade of grass and curled beneath the sleeping roots of the mopane trees. A pale light spread across the savanna, softening the outlines of the terrain in a faint silver glaze. In the lowlands, mist hung above the river like a veil, motionless but waiting. The herd had arrived at the crossing just after dawn. It was a seasonal route, well-worn, familiar. Buffalo had followed this path for generations, their hoofprints etched into memory as much as into mud. The river before them was wide and unhurried, its surface placid, reflecting the soft pink of the sky and the silhouettes of the thorn trees beyond. There was no reason to hesitate. And yet, one bull stopped. Not a dominant male, not an old or frail animal, a strong, healthy adult in the prime of his life. He approached the edge of the water, sniffed, pawed at the muddy soil, and froze. The herd moved past him, stepping confidently into the current. Calves bellowed and splashed between their mother's legs. Hooves stirred silt from the riverbed. But the bull didn't follow. His head turned slowly toward the center of the river, ears forward, tail rigid. His nostrils flared once, twice. Then he backed away, deliberately, step by step, until he stood clear of the bank. It was subtle, barely noticeable to the rangers, tracking the herd remotely. But in the field, a nearby observer might have sensed it. The air around the riverbank had grown heavy. The stillness no longer felt like calm. It felt suspended, like a held breath. 10 minutes passed. 20. The bull remained apart from the others, muscles tense beneath a coat already damp with morning sweat. His eyes stayed locked on the water, unmoving. A single breeze lifted a curl of mist, and the river surface trembled, just for a moment, not from wind, but from something underneath. A rhythm deep and wrong, invisible but present. The buffalo turned. He walked away. Behind him, the river began to listen to gravity in a new way. The river was wide, but not deep at this point in the season, no more than shoulder high on the larger buffalo. Most of the herd had already waded halfway across, moving slow but steady, chests parting the water with practiced ease. Mud churned beneath them, rising in clouds that dyed the current brown. Calves cried and stumbled but were lifted gently by the eddies, nudged onward by their mother's horns. But something was wrong. Those in the rear slowed. A dull unease rippled through the animals still approaching the river's edge, their hooves sinking just a little too far into the soil, as if the earth beneath the reeds had softened beyond what memory allowed. A young cow paused mid-step. Her legs trembled, though there was no sound to trigger fear. Beneath the surface, the water no longer moved in a single direction. A low, circular pull had begun, slow at first, but growing with each second. The current had changed, though it gave no visual sign. Not yet. A downstream swirl emerged, harmless looking to the human eye, but the buffalo sensed the shift in pressure. The calves became more vocal. One slipped near a submerged dip and was caught by a subtle undertow that pulled it slightly off course. The mother turned, fought the resistance, and pulled her calf back toward shallower footing. They regrouped. The herd slowed to a crawl. The lead bull, now mid-river, lifted his head and stared toward the far shore, but he too began to hesitate. The water resisted more than it should have. The footing beneath his hooves was suddenly too soft. A warthog on the opposite bank snorted and bolted away from the river without clear reason. The trees stood still. The birds remained quiet. The silence felt unnatural. The only sound was the soft splashing of hooves and the hush of something far deeper, pulling quietly from below. The kind of pull no satellite could read, the kind that moved silently through silt and shadow and memory. And far behind them, on higher ground, the lone buffalo who had refused to cross stood watching, unmoving, as if waiting for the earth to speak. Several kilometers upstream, the river moved with deceptive grace, winding past dense brush and sun-cracked rock shelves. On the surface, all appeared normal, smooth, continuous flow, the kind that masks disruption. But beneath, erosion had already begun. Deep below the visible channel, an undercurrent had been carving silently into the clay walls of the riverbed for weeks. It had started small, a single point of turbulence, born of last season's flood, that had widened imperceptibly with every passing day. Silt had been displaced, roots had been loosened, sandstone had been hollowed by persistence, not force. No equipment was stationed here. This section wasn't considered high risk. The floodplain maps showed stability. The last geological survey was 5 years old and had revealed only minor sediment layering. But time, water, and pressure have no regard for reports. The undercutting had grown more aggressive after a recent mountain storm. Not enough to raise the river's surface, but enough to increase the velocity beneath. Now the current wasn't flowing over the landscape. It was reshaping it. Farther down, near the crossing where the buffalo hesitated, the ground seemed intact. But already the foundation was changing. Water had worked its way beneath the embankment like termites through wood, creating voids beneath what appeared solid. One heavy step in the wrong place could have set it off. The herd couldn't know the mechanics, but they could feel the tension humming through the earth. The vibrations were there, low, irregular, hidden beneath the drone of insects and the whisper of reeds. Where engineers trusted instruments, the buffalo listened with their bones, and the soil beneath their hooves was whispering a slow warning. No alarms, no shaking, no collapse. Not yet. But the river had already begun to betray its shape. Inside the monitoring cabin at Makala Wildlife Station, Grace stared at the movement heat maps glowing on her laptop screen. A subtle shift had caught her eye. Not in the river, but in the buffalo. For the past 2 migration seasons, the herd had used the same crossing point without deviation. But now, several of the tagged individuals had paused longer than usual near the bank, some turning completely away and redirecting upstream. Others had crossed, but slower, clustered more tightly than average. The data wasn't dramatic, but Grace had learned to distrust silence when it came in patterns. She pulled up moisture saturation data from a network of buried soil sensors spaced along the lower bank. The readings weren't alarming, but they were odd. A small but persistent uptick in soil fluidity beneath what should be stable ground. No rainfall in over a week, no release from upstream dams, and yet the subsurface layers read wetter than they should. And that's not surface saturation, she murmured. That's coming from below. In the corner, Matteo leaned over a second screen, flipping through time-lapse satellite images. Something else, he said. Vegetation edge moved. Right here, he pointed to a faint, barely visible change, where a patch of reeds had tilted toward the river, not over weeks, but over days. Erosion, he asked? Or subsidence? Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her attention to the undercurrent models. They had limited resolution, nothing precise. But a few of the predictive current paths suggested increasing turbulence just below the river's edge, not enough to raise flags for the park system's automatic alerts, but enough to trouble her. She checked the animal telemetry again. The buffalo who had turned back the earliest, the one whose hesitation had been recorded an hour before the rest, had not returned. He now lingered far from the waterline, grazing uphill, well outside the normal corridor. Alone, but alert. Let's prep a drone, Grace said finally. Low-altitude pass over the crossing. Thermal imaging, too. You think something's breaking loose? Matteo asked. Grace glanced out the window, where the sun now beat down hard across the plain, drying the surface but hiding the pressure building quietly beneath. I think something already has, she replied. Late in the afternoon, the light grew harsh. Shadows shortened, and the air shimmered above the cracked soil near the river's edge. The drone sent by Grace buzzed overhead, invisible to the animals but recording everything. Multispectral footage, thermal readings, depth irregularities. But even before it could return to the station, the ground moved. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't loud. It was a deep, internal release, the kind that only the earth understands. A muffled pop, like the sigh of something ancient, and then the riverbank gave way. Not all at once. It started with a single caving segment along the west side, where root systems had been hollowed from beneath. As if pulled downward by a suction no eye could see, the shelf folded in, collapsing with a low, wet crack. The sound echoed like thunder inside the cavity it revealed, followed by the groan of snapping trunks and the splash of entire sections of land plunging into the water. The current responded immediately, rushing in to fill the new vacuum, swirling sediment into a brown storm. A tree that had stood for decades was ripped from its hold and carried downstream like driftwood. The herd panicked. Buffalo nearest the edge bolted back up the slope, hooves churning into already unstable earth. Calves cried out, lost in the confusion, some stumbling as the ground underfoot shook in pulses, not waves. The bull, who had crossed early but lingered near the midbank, turned and charged forward, cutting through the current to reach his herd. But the river, now disturbed, fought back. The water surged sideways. Its logic changed. Centrifugal forces from the undercut channel forced currents into spirals. One young buffalo was pulled into a side eddy and nearly disappeared beneath the foam before being hauled up by its mother's horns. At the top of the slope, the lone buffalo, the first one who had turned away, stood utterly still. He watched everything unfold with eyes wide, body taut, but unmoving. He had known. In the command cabin, Grace's screen lit up red as the drone feed transmitted breaking data, infrared spikes at the collapse zone, seismic tremors reading above normal, and a heat signature in the water, not explained by sun exposure. The drone, mid-pass, caught a clear shot of the sink forming. Not a full collapse yet, but a growing scar pulling both land and river inward. "The brake line's active," Mateo said. His voice was flat, but his eyes were wide. "We need to get people out of that sector now." Grace was already on the radio. Down by the river, silence settled again. But not the calm kind. The kind that waits for the next rupture. The river never looked the same after it moved like that. By evening, its entire character had changed. What once was a smooth ribbon gliding through dry grasslands had become jagged, unpredictable, broken into eddies, sharp angles, and a growing central swirl where the collapse had begun. The drone returned to the station battered by strong updrafts, its final feed showing broken sections of bank still crumbling slowly, as if the land had lost its confidence in holding shape. Rangers arrived in pairs on foot and by vehicle, guided by thermal scans and telemetry data. They kept their distance from the river's edge, though it wasn't always clear where the edge was anymore. The soil, now stripped of structure, behaved like fluid. One officer stepped too close to a muddy section that had appeared stable, only to sink nearly to the knees in thick, shifting silt. The team roped off the area. Markers were placed. Measurements were taken. None of it slowed the river. Grace stood above it all on a small rise overlooking the collapsed corridor. Her binoculars tracked the buffalo, now clustered in a tight semicircle uphill. They hadn't scattered. They were watching, all of them, facing the water, not grazing, not moving. She knew that kind of posture. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. "We weren't early," she muttered. "We were late." They were early. Mateo stood beside her, holding a tablet displaying subsurface flow estimates. "It's not done shifting," he said. "We think the bank will collapse again by dawn. We're logging new fractures every hour." Grace nodded. She had seen it before. Not exactly this, but similar scars where geology and water turned against each other. But never here. Never on this route. Never with so little warning. Below them, the herd began to move. Not toward the river, but parallel to it, keeping distance, finding new ground. The first to lead was the lone bull, who had turned back that morning. He walked at a steady pace, unhurried but sure. The rest followed him without resistance. Not a stampede. A decision. Behind them, the river groaned, and still beneath the soil, the undercurrent whispered forward, digging, dragging, reshaping. In its wake, the earth would write a new path. Weeks later, the river had settled, but not in the way people hoped. It didn't return to its old shape. It carved a new one. The brake line had continued shifting days after the collapse, forming a horseshoe curve where there had once been a straight corridor. Entire sections of grassland were gone, now replaced by slumped clay walls and waterlogged debris. Trees had fallen, roots had drowned. The shoreline now leaned inward, unstable and raw, like a wound trying to heal. The telemetry tags on the buffalo told their own story. The herd never approached the old crossing again. They had mapped a wide arc around it, moving 3 kilometers upstream before fording the river at a narrow bend, flanked by dense brush and rocky footing. It was a slower path, more rugged, but safer. They had adapted, and they had done it before the data arrived. At the station, Grace reviewed the logs over and over, not for fault, but for understanding. The subsurface alerts had all been beneath the sensitivity thresholds. The erosion models had not predicted failure for at least another 2 months, but the buffalo had known within hours. Something had registered, in the vibration of the ground, in the scent of the water, in the pressure in the air. Whatever it was, it had bypassed science and gone straight into instinct. Mateo entered the cabin holding a file, a new satellite pass, showing the permanent change to the terrain. "We'll have to update the maps," he said quietly. "Whole structures shifted." Grace didn't look up. "They've already updated theirs," she said. That evening, from a distance, she watched the herd as they moved across the new crossing. There was no panic, no stalling, just motion, collective, calm, assured. The young walked where their mothers walked. The old ones held the sides. No one pushed, no one rushed. It wasn't just memory, it was transmission. And beneath the shifting winds and soft insect noise, the earth held a silence that wasn't emptiness, it was remembrance. Because even when the soil forgets its shape, the animals don't.